Kitchener stitch or grafting can be used to seamlessly join two separate pieces of knitting together or to close the top of a tube such as a sock toe or a hat. And to set up for Kitchener stitch, you want your stitches on 2 needles. If you have 2 separate pieces of knitting, that'll be 2 separate needles. If you have a tube like this, you can transfer all your stitches to 2 DPNs or each tip of a circular needle. And if you're working with 2 separate pieces of knitting, you want to hold them so that the right side of one piece is facing towards you and the right side of the other piece is facing away from you, with the wrong sides together. And usually you will work your Kitchener stitch with your working yarn, and you want to cut a tail that's at least 3 times as long as the width you're joining. I'm going to show you how to work Kitchener stitch with a contrast scrap yarn, just so it's easier for you to see which stitches are the original stitches and which are my Kitchener stitch seam stitches. So I'm going to thread my yarn onto a blunt darning needle. This is definitely not somewhere where you want to be worried about splitting stitches. And then I'm going to begin at the front, and I'm going to insert my darning needle into the first stitch on the needle as if to purl. This, and then pull the yarn through. Because I'm using a separate piece of yarn, I'm just going to leave a tail, and I've sort of pulled through enough to complete my seam. And then on the back, the first stitch on the back needle, I'm going to insert my darning needle into that stitch knitwise and pull the yarn through again. Just make sure my original yarn tail doesn't get caught up in that. And then I'm going to go back to this stitch on my front needle. And then I'm going to go through it knitwise this time, and then drop it off the end of the needle and pull the yarn through. So when I pull the yarn through, I'm not pulling it tight. I want to sort of match the tension of my original stitches. So I'm just pulling it tight enough to create a loop about the same size as my original stitches. And then my next step is to go through the next stitch on the front needle. So I'm staying on my front needle and I'm going through the next stitch as if to purl. Then I'm going to go to the back, and this is the stitch we've already been through once. I'm going to go into purlwise and drop that stitch off the needle, and then I'm going to stay at the back and go into the next stitch knitwise. So then I'm going to come to the front. I've already been into this stitch once. I'm going to go into it again knitwise and drop it off. Every time I drop a stitch off, I'm going to stay on that needle. So I'm now going into my next stitch purlwise, and it stays on the needle. I'm going to go to the back, into that stitch purlwise and drop it off. Pull the yarn through. And then I'm staying in the back because I dropped that stitch off, and I'm going to go into the next stitch on that needle knitwise. And then I'm going to come to the front and go into that first stitch knitwise and drop it off. And then into the next stitch on the front purlwise and leave it on. So I'm going to the back, into that next stitch, that first stitch purlwise and drop it off. and then into the next stitch on the back knitwise and leave it on. So your sequence is front, knit off, front purl on, back purl off, back knit on. And you keep repeating those 4 steps until you've joined all of your stitches. And as you're working, you can use your darning needle to just sort of work along your stitches, evening out the tension. But the key thing is that you don't want to make it really tight. If you pull the Kitchener stitch really tight, the stitches you're adding in will disappear and you won't have an elastic seam that sort of continues your knitting. You'll have something quite inelastic and not very strong. So I'm pretty happy with that. That looks like a similar size to my knit stitches, and you can see that my knit stitches now curve over that edge, which is really pleasing. So we're going to continue that sequence until the whole seam is joined, and even out the tension every few stitches with your darning needle to make it nice and neat. I've worked my Kitchener stitch until I've only got a few stitches left. I've got 2 on the front needle and 2 on the back. And I'm going to begin my sequence again. So my first step is front knit off, and then I can do my, go into my second stitch purlwise and leave it on the needle. So my front purl on. Then I'm going to go to the back and do my back purl off, and then my back knit on, and then I'm going to go to the front, do my front knit off. I can't do my front purl on, so I'm just going to go straight to step 3 and do my back purl off to complete the Kitchener stitch. And at the end, you might want to even up the tension of your Kitchener stitch on those last few stitches, and you might find that a little bit of slack in the live stitches that you were joining has also ended up in that last stitch. So you can just even that out and sort of pull that back along a little bit. Go. So that's my finished Kitchener stitch join, and you can see it's created a lovely seamless part of the fabric. My knit stitches flow over that edge, and if you get the tension just right, and of course you don't use a contrast color, then you won't even be able to find where the Kitchener stitch is in your fabric.